All right. Well, good day, everyone. We have some folks trickling in through the waiting room, but welcome to another edition of the Garden Hour with MU Extension. Happy that you could join us today. Weather's warming up. We got some unfortunate drought conditions starting to move forward in the state here that we'll learn a little bit more about in a couple minutes. But just so you know, we are a resource for you across the state of Missouri. We have field specialists spread across the state. We're always happy to help you out with all of your gardening questions. If you're not in touch with your local horticulture specialist, you can use this coverage map, jot down their email there. We're always happy to help. And if we can't get an answer for you, we will find an answer. We got some open positions currently. Those are in the process of being filled. If you're in a county that's listed as open, feel free to reach out to the horticulture specialist in the neighboring counties. In case you didn't know, we also do this program as a live stream. We have snippets, so we take kind of like the highlight reel from each garden hour, and we put a video up with that topic. And then you can also view the full garden hour, all of our past garden hours. So if we come across a rainy day and you want to check those out, you can look at all those past videos, and you can also live stream them. That MUIPM YouTube channel has all kinds of great videos. In addition to horticulture, we have things like livestock, as well as commercial horticulture for fruit and vegetable growers. But at that, I am going to go ahead and hand it over to our moderator today, Ramon Arancibia.
Thank you, Eli. Justin. We're going to start today. Anthony is here, so we're going to start with the weather forecast.
Okay, good afternoon. I've got two things to show you right off the bat before we get to the weather, and you can see on the screen right there on radar, there's actually green, yellow, and red on the map today, which is good. A lot of you in western Missouri will get some rain, and it'll be hit and miss, unfortunately, but at least there is some coming. And I want to put in a shameless plug for the Missouri Climate Center. And if we need to get this number up past 225 followers, so if you or your friends could like our Facebook and Twitter pages, that would be great. I'm going to work on getting content to this daily from going forward. So please like us on the Missouri Climate Center Facebook and Twitter. Okay, now let's go to the forecast, and I'm going to get through this quick. Thank you to Debbie for giving the forecast last week. And unfortunately, I gave you a good forecast, and I say unfortunately because the forecast was for dry conditions. Yesterday, we saw temperatures in the mid-80s across much of Missouri, maybe a few lower 80s in the south part of Missouri. And those of you who are seeing sunshine today will probably see mid-80s again today. If you're lucky enough to be cloudy like we are here in Boone County, you'll probably stay in the upper 70s to low 80s. But we're seeing some precipitation, which is great. We have a situation very similar to what happened two weeks ago. Stubborn high pressure is moving out of the region. Oops. I'm trying to make sure my arrow is showing you that. It's moving out of the region, and we're going to have this generalized low pressure area move in for us this week. And that's going to give us scattered showers and thunderstorms all week, the best chance on Friday. I've got moist air coming in from the Gulf of Mexico. Yesterday, the dew point started to creep up into the 60s, which is great. And if we want rain. A little worse for human comfort, obviously. And the jet stream is taking up its regular summer pattern, which is to go across Canada. And again, this high pressure, which was over us last week, is finally moving off to the east, and we'll have lower pressure settle in for a while to give us a chance of showers and thunderstorms. This part is being like a broken record. I mean, there's places in the last 30 days that have gotten decent precip below I-44, but in general, the entire state lost about an inch of precip relative to normal during the last week. And so now everybody in the state is appearing in dry conditions with the month of May. The month of May is climatologically our wettest month, and so that's why we're seeing that. In addition to liking the Missouri Climate Center, again, if you're not a CocoRa's observer, please join us. We need you. We want you to report your rainfall totals, and that's always good. Again, the drought conditions, where do we stand with respect to drought? The week before, we were showing dry for much of the state above I-44. This week features the expansion, a little bit of D2 conditions, but in general, the same areas are still dry. Tomorrow's map, I expect to be a little bit worse than this. I expect that tomorrow's map will show an expansion of D2 and maybe even D3. But something, again, we go across the state. I said that for May, we lost relative to average. Again, in Boone County, 3.94 inches. You'd think that's pretty good. But again, in May, when it's our wettest time, that's actually below normal. And we, again, last week at this time, we were still in surplus for the month. And again, the rest of the state followed suit, losing about an inch relative to normal. Temperature wise, we haven't been too bad for May. And tomorrow, next week, I'll have the spring roundup, March through May, the summary statistics. Some folks have asked, where are we with respect to El Nino? El Nino is coming on slowly but surely. We're seeing these waters in the eastern tropical Pacific warm up, and that's somewhat good news for the later part of the summer. The models are showing that we should go into an El Nino. Some of the models are showing a much more aggressive El Nino. Others are showing a more muted El Nino, and this is the composite of all of these projections. Well, what's changing? Last week, we had a ridge over North America for much of the middle of May. Have the same ridge over North America, but it's getting weaker. So here's the pressure at 500 millibars. And here's the difference from normal. We can see in the middle of May, it was very strongly positive. And now it's toward the end of May, that's weakened a great deal. And that's good news for us. The pros at NCEP are seeing that much of Missouri will get some precip this week, which will be welcome no matter how much you get. Maybe a little less in the eastern part of Missouri, but an inch or more in the western part. And again, I see that that's going to be the trend here. Equal chances of summertime temperatures being close to above normal, below normal, or normal. So we can't read too much into this for the summer forecast. The pros are still bullish on precipitation, and they must be looking down the road at July and August. The latest 6 to 10 day outlook shows above normal precip across much of the West, and that is great news, and near normal precipitation for much of Missouri, except for the far eastern part. The 3 to 4 week outlook, again, warm temperatures expected, which is what we would expect when things are dry, but again, above normal precipitation and an axis across much of the country, and at least equal chances for us. That's good news in the 3 to 4 week outlook. My outlook for the week, and I forgot to change this from Memorial Day to Monday, but today, again, Western Missouri is seeing some of this hit and miss thunderstorm activity. That'll continue into the evening, and some of you in the East will see it later in the day. Then these heat of the day thunderstorms will die during the night. You'll see the same pattern repeat tomorrow, some showers and thunderstorms during the day, then tapering off at night. Our best chance is Friday. I think Friday we're going to see many of us across the state get showers and thunderstorms both Friday and Friday night. The odds are really good for that day. Then Saturday and Sunday we'll go back into this repeat pattern of temperatures in the 80s to low 90s, and thunderstorms maybe in the afternoon, but tapering off in the evening. And for Saturday and Sunday, I foresee that happening east of Route 63. So again, those of you in far eastern Missouri may not get as much of this activity Saturday and Sunday. And then Monday, Tuesday, again, the repeating of upper 80s to low 90s, and chance of showers and thunderstorms, especially across western Missouri. Any questions?
Yeah, please put your question or in the chat box for Tony. That was a good presentation, Tony. Thank you that you're back. Although Debbie did a good job last week too.
She did.
We always want you to be around with us to answer more questions. So if you please put your questions in the chat box, or if you have additional questions on other topics, put them in the website. Debbie, what's the website where they can put the questions for next week, for example, if we don't answer today? So we're gonna go now to, if there is no question for Tony, we're gonna go to answer the questions that we have for this week. The first question is, my 15-year-old potentilla shrub is looking quite ragged. Is there pruning or other practices I can do to rejuvenate its looks overall? Should it just prune out apparently dead branches one by one? And here is Eli Isle, who's going to answer this question.
Thanks, Ramon. Yep, so we're going to talk about potentilla or potentilla pruning. So these are the pictures from the person that sent it in. So you can see that there's a lot of new growth on top, some new growth on top, but most of it is dead underneath, and it doesn't look great. And he wants to, or she wants to, rejuvenate its look overall. And the answer is to do a very radical pruning, do extensive rejuvenation. So for this year, there's nothing to do except to enjoy what you have. But then next year in March in Missouri, you're going to want to go ahead and do this extensive rejuvenation. And so that's where you're going to cut it all the way back to the almost to the ground, 3 to 4 inches from the ground, and remove all of that, and then it'll grow back up. And this is something you want to do on a regular cycle every 3 to 4 years. So I hope that solves it. I look forward to hearing back from them next year about how well it worked. Ramon, that's what I got on pruning potentilla.
Thank you, Eli. That's good. Good to have a website too to look into it. But yeah, if that works for the person who asked the question, that we would like to hear back from it. So if there is no additional questions, we move to our second question for the week. And that would be, my neighbor farmers spray 5 times a spring and kill my garden and everything else around my place. I've already talked to them so many times and they don't care if they kill everything I grow. Don't I have anything I can do? Got rid of my bees, ready to quit. Well, that's a complicated question, and we have Justin to address this situation. Justin?
All right, thanks, Ramon. So herbicide drift, a very frustrating situation to be involved with. So I'm going to give a little bit of overview about drift and how you might be able to respond to it. So the problem that we have is herbicide movement off of the site of application. Oftentimes, this herbicide is used as an over-the-top spray on genetically modified crops that have been bred to be resistant to these herbicides, or a pre-plant burn down spray where folks are prepping in the spring and burning off any weeds that might be present in the field before planting. So there's a couple ways herbicide can move. One is what we call drift. So that's basically as the herbicide comes out of the sprayer, it moves across the landscape. So this is actually droplets from the sprayer moving across the landscape. Volatilization, this is when the residue, pesticide residue on the crops turns into a vapor form, and particularly in atmospheric conversions. I'm not a professor on thermodynamics, but essentially the air that's closer to the soil surface is cooler. And so when that turns into a gaseous vapor, as opposed to going up into the atmosphere, it moves laterally across the landscape. Runoff can happen where the herbicide basically moves across the soil surface and water from rainfall. Some of the common culprits are some of the broadleaf herbicides, 2,4-D and dicamba. This can happen from field crop application as well as from lawn and landscape application. So the best thing that you can do to prevent drift is talk with your neighbors. So having an open conversation with them about your concerns, the fact that you're growing plants that are sensitive to herbicides, that you have a lot of money invested in your landscape and your garden. It's also a good idea to talk with your lawn care company. Oftentimes broadleaf herbicides are applied to lawns, and depending on how much communication you have with your lawn care company, you might or might not know what they're putting down. If you're going to use broadleaf herbicides, 2,4-D and dicamba are common in many lawn herbicides. Avoid spraying it in hot weather, and best time to control perennial weeds with broadleaf herbicides is actually in the fall. You can use signage around the garden or around field borders. If you're doing application yourself, you can use a cone or a hooded sprayer. This picture really on the left isn't the greatest example. That cone should be directly closer to the ground to prevent any kind of drift. And in your own landscape, there's a lot of options to avoid herbicide use altogether, which could include mulches and hand weeding as well as other practices. For specialty crop growers, for folks that are growing for any kind of sale, there is a website called DriftWatch where sensitive crop sites as well as apiaries can be registered. Basically, it's like a Google Maps program where you can draw around the site, making sure to exclude any structures, and there is a half-acre minimum size that can be plotted using this software. Ideally, every pesticide applicator looks at this before they apply pesticides. It is not mandatory, however, so there might be folks that are not looking at it. Regardless of whether you're mapping you can order signs from Driftwatch as well. So thinking about herbicide drift, broadleaf herbicides like 2,4-D or dicamba, they cause a fairly characteristic upward curling or puckering of the leaves, which you can see in this middle photo. It can also cause elongation of stems and leaves. You can see in this picture on the right from a greenhouse I visited, very elongated leaf structure. The picture on the left shows you how elongated those stems can get. It looks like this plant was grown in the shade, but it was in full sun the whole time. You can see some of these little younger leaves are twisting as well. There's varying sensitivity, and we don't have a lot of great data on what plants are sensitive, what plants are somewhat sensitive, what plants are not sensitive. We do know that tomatoes are very sensitive. And dicamba drift, that's an over-the-top spray, generally on soybeans, generally happens in the beginning of the summer. There is a cutoff date for application on agricultural fields for soybeans as well as for cotton. But besides dicamba, 2,4-D as a burn down pre-plant could happen at any time of the year or as an over-the-top application on genetically resistant crops. Unfortunately, both of these herbicides can both drift physically, that lateral drift of the droplets, but they can also volatilize, turn into a gaseous form, and move off site. Non-drift ways that herbicide can come into the garden is through contaminated compost and manure. So these herbicides are very persistent. They're sprayed on hay fields and pastures to control broadleaf weeds. But often the time, the way this occurs is that hay or that pasture is sprayed, it's baled, it's fed to an animal, it goes through the gut of the animal, into manure, through the composting process, into the garden, and then is uptaken by plants. Unfortunately, these can be very persistent, 3 or more years until they degrade in the soil. This produces very, very tightly curled leaves. There is a simple test you can use using green beans. We call that a bioassay, where basically you're planting some pots with some of the compost in it and some pots with just a potting mix. And you can see if there's any difference in the green beans between those two treatments. And if there is no difference, you can be pretty sure that there's not any kind of contamination issue. We do have a good publication that talks a little bit more about this and how to do this green bean test. Non-drift lookalikes. So physiological leaf roll. On the picture on the top right, you can see these leaves are puckered upwards or curled upwards, but this is not an herbicide issue. This is caused by drought stress, could be caused by excessive winds during dry soil conditions, could be caused by excessive pruning when soil conditions are very dry. You'll probably notice it first in the older leaves before you notice it in the newer leaves. Thrips damage can also cause distorted leaves. You can see some tomato leaves on the left and some pepper leaves on the right that look kind of strange, but that's caused by thrip injury. That's a little bit more common in greenhouse situations, but at first glance, you might think that there's some kind of herbicide issue going on there. A couple other non-drift lookalikes, tobacco mosaic virus. This is a virus that's generally comes in on infected seeds, not something we see very often, but it does look pretty strange, and you might think that that's an herbicide. The picture on the bottom is broad mite damage from on peppers. So you notice the upward curling of the leaves, but these leaves will become hardened and thickened and more narrow. And you might also notice that blooms are aborting and that the overall plant growth is severely stunted. So if you think you have a drift event, you can contact your local extension office. We're happy to look at pictures, talk to you about the situation. We're not a regulatory agency. it's definitely good to try to resolve with the neighbor first. Sometimes I've had situations where folks have been hit with herbicide. They talk to the neighbor and the neighbor says, okay, send me a bill for the damage that was caused. If an appropriate resolution can't be reached, you can contact the Missouri Department of Agriculture. If they deem that there's been a misapplication or a pesticide incident, whoever applies that pesticide, assuming you can figure that out, will receive a warning notice or possibly a fine. The only other option outside of that, it's important to note, the Missouri Department of Agriculture will not in any way facilitate compensation between you and the person that applied the herbicide. The only option outside of that would be to pursue civil court action, which obviously would involve lawyer fees. Some documentation that can be helpful to record the weather conditions when you think the drift's happening. You can draw field maps, take pictures of the damage, record what plants are present, what plants were impacted. And also another thing that can be helpful is to keep purchase and sales invoices to show how much money was spent on that crop. If you do need to file an incident report with the Missouri Department of Agriculture, the form can be found on their website. You can see what it looks like on the bottom there. It's called a pesticide incident report. You must do this within 30 days of the incident. I was talking to the pesticide enforcement person at Missouri Department of Agriculture. He said that they're generally able to do a follow-up phone call and or site visit to a homeowner or to a grower within about 48 hours of that report being submitted. So here's the phone number. Missouri Department of Agriculture did let me know that they will collect plant samples if that's necessary to have those samples analyzed to determine if any herbicide is present. I do encourage folks, if you think you have an herbicide drift issue, reach out to us, report the incident to the Missouri Department of Agriculture. I know this is a frustrating situation for everyone that has to deal with it. I think the more that our regulators know this is happening, the more likely there might be some shift in policy regarding fines or other ways to deter this from happening. And that's all I got.
Thank you, Justin. That was good information, actually. I would like to add, though, if you decide not to pursue a legal action, or you don't need, or keep the plans until the Department of Ag come and see the problem. But if you're not going to pursue or do anything, do not incorporate those plants back in the soil, because that compound, that herbicide, will still be active after going through the plant. It's in the plant. So if you put it down in the soil, it's going to stay there for a few years. So if you decide not to do anything, pull those plants. If some plants can recover after the drift, but some don't, or at the end of the season, do not incorporate those plants into the soil. Just pull them out and burn them. Or don't do compost either, because the compost will recycle the chemical into the ground. So just burn them if you're not doing anything else. Another tip that I wanted to add: when you applied an herbicide, Justin put using a cone in the sprayer. That's a very good idea. But if you want to reduce the drift in another way, you can use brush. You can paint your weed or your shrub that you want to kill with the herbicide, so the drift would be minimal. Just use a paintbrush and with the herbicide and paint the foliage of that particular plant. If you have anything else to add, Justin, or if we have any questions?
No, that's a good point you brought up, though, Ramon. And they also do make, they call them wick applicators. I've seen them before where they kind of look like a hockey stick. They have a sponge on the bottom. You can fill it with solution and then brush it on. But yeah, that's a really good point. Thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, that's right. The wick is also well used. I mean, it used to use before. I haven't seen it much, but it's a good tool too. Anyway, if we don't have more questions. Do you have a comment there, Debbie?
No, I don't have a comment. There is a
Okay.
question, but it has nothing to do with the drift, so we'll hopefully get to that soon.
All right. Then we'll go to another topic. Those were the 2 questions for this week. So we're gonna go into another topic, and that is about direct sowing annual flowers in the garden. And Eli is gonna touch that subject.
All right, thanks, Ramon. Yeah, so this is something that's pretty neat. Hadn't thought about. Glad somebody asked about, can we do this? So late spring flower sowing. So summer and fall flowers, this is what we're talking about, that you can do late spring sowing. They thrive in hot weather. They will need a little bit of extra care to ensure germination and early growth, because it is, especially over here in the eastern part of the state, starting to get hot and dry. It's nice because they can be used for cut flowers in the home, and it's a great youth gardening activity. I think there should be a link for a youth gardening fact sheet about growing flowers with your kids. So there are a few considerations. We need to talk about deadheads, the sun, and fertility. Not talking about Dead and Company that's coming to play in Missouri next week, but deadheading your flowers. So to keep your blooms actively coming along once they start flowering, either cut them and harvest them in the vase, or you need to cut off the old flowers, because the plant is trying to reproduce and set seed, and it does that through the flower. So if you can not let it get to that point, it'll keep pumping out new flowers. The sun, these are all full sun plants, full sunflowers. They all need at least 8 hours of sun a day. These are not to be planted in the shade. And finally, fertility, not the average fertility per woman per year in a country, but these flowers all don't need a lot of nitrogen. If you have an imbalance of excess nitrogen in your soil, the flowers will just put on green growth instead of flowering. So fertilizing with compost is good. Doesn't have a lot of nitrogen. If you do need to add some fertilizer, use one that has more phosphorus than nitrogen in it. So one of my favorite flowers, when I was first growing vegetables in 2002 and selling them at the farmer's market, it was suggested to plant some flowers to sell along with my vegetables. And so I planted Cosmos. And so some tips: you want to select some early flowering cultivars. It does take quite a long time for these to flower, 8 to 12 weeks. Once you put them in the ground, it's going to be 5 to 7 days to germinate. Soil temperature of at least 70 degrees, which we should be past that everywhere in the state. You can only plant them 1/8 of an inch deep, and they want to be planted really shallow, and they will thrive in drought and low fertility. So once they're up and going, you can just let them go. It's really nice. And there's lots of different genotypes. Marigold brings me back to whenever I smell one, reminds me of being in a garden with my dad when I was a little boy. Once again, you also, since we are planting, I'm going to try and get some seeds planted after work today, but we're getting towards June, so you do want to find early flowering ones so you can get some time where they will flower before the frost comes. These will take 4 to 7 days to germinate. Warm soil, which we have. Plant these a bit deeper, 1/4 inch deep. And marigolds tolerates drought, but they do need some regular watering. Sunflower. So the great thing about this is you could plant 3 or 4 different cultivars of sunflower today. And they have different flowering times, so you can make sure you have fresh blooms coming along. And these can also be deadheaded after, if you're not trying to produce sunflower seed. And with that mast here we had last year, not sure if you'll be able to get any without the squirrels getting them all. You can deadhead them and it'll put out side branches and produce more flowers. These take a little bit longer to germinate, and you could have planted them much earlier, at least 50 degrees. These are used as a row crop. Plant 1 inch deep, and these need probably the most fertility out of any of the varieties that we talk about, and probably the least drought resistant, but they can handle some drought. And then finally, probably my favorite, there's a lot of interesting cultivars of zinnia. The AAS selections always please, and they're very easy to grow. 4 to 7 days to germinate. I just learned you can propagate them by cutting. So after you have them growing, you can cut them, remove the lower leaves without a flower on it, and root it and then plant it again, which is pretty neat. You can plant the seeds 1/4 inch deep, similar to marigolds, moderate fertility, tolerate drought better than overly wet. This is something really common to see when you're growing zinnias, is the susceptibility to powdery mildew. So we have great conditions to grow zinnias right now, with it being dry out, as long as you can get the water underneath. So if there's a way that you can water the ground as opposed to watering the foliage with your zinnias, that'll prolong the amount of time when you don't have powdery mildew show up. All right, so that's what I have on late season sowing flowers. I think that it's really valuable to have that aesthetic in your garden and not just grow vegetables. Thank you. That's all I have.
Ramon, you're still muted.
Thank you, Debbie. Sorry about that. Our next subject that we're going to talk today is actually Debbie's going to talk about it, is watering wisely. This is a subject that, as Tony has mentioned, we went through a drought here, and it's raining again, but we still might need more water. So Debbie has some good suggestions here for this situation. Debbie?
Thank you. So I have some tips for watering during a drought. As we've mentioned before, every Wednesday morning about 8:30, we all get together as horticulture folks, and one of our state specialists, Dr. Dave Trinkline, said, hey, let's really pay attention to the drought and try to prevent the severity of a drought in our gardens as best we can. So he offered some great advice, and we thought it was important for us to share this information with you today. So tips for watering during a drought. When it starts to get dry, then we need to start preparing for a drought. So always pay attention to the forecast. And we always appreciate Tony being here, because we know he's going to provide us the information on what the weather is going to do. This map that you see right here of Missouri is the map from last Thursday. Every Thursday, there is an update in the morning of where the drought is. And I know that at one point, I'm in Jefferson County. My county was yellow. Now it is white. I'm surprised that last Thursday it still stayed white instead of being yellow. Yellow is minor. Red is pretty, I think it's zone 1. It could be 3 or 4 as far as on the drought monitor list there. So always pay attention to that drought if at all possible. So tips for watering. So what are some? One of the things we always like to suggest is water if at all possible in the morning. That enables the plants, if you have any water that gets onto the leaves of the plant. Remember, a lot of our diseases need water in some form in order to be able to grow and spread. So water in the morning, that enables our plants then to have the dryness of the sun throughout the day, and it enables it to go into the evening without having wet leaves. Water slowly and deeply water once a week, at least 1 inch of water. And this is really important because that way the water gets really deep into the soil. Water it at a slow pace that allows it to infiltrate on and into the water instead of just rolling down off of the water and not actually going deep in. So how you actually put the water on is extremely important. You can use what we call the screwdriver test. Just take a regular screwdriver and try to poke it down into the soil. The easier it goes in can indicate that there's moisture there, but it also can indicate that there's a lot of sand that might be there. Well, most of Missouri is not sandy, but we do have sections in the southeast part of our state where it can be a little bit more sandy. So know what your soil type is when you use that screwdriver test. Use a soaker hose or drip irrigation. This was a great picture that I found on the internet where they did this with the soaker hose and just kind of went back and forth throughout their plantings. That's really, really good. Water at the base of the plants to avoid diseases, as I kind of mentioned just here. I don't have a soaker hose. I have 2 raised beds. And so I enjoy being out in the evenings, and I will just sit there and just listen to my headphones or something and just slowly water my 2 raised beds of cut flowers and go about my evening. And that way the leaves are not getting wet. Pay attention to microclimates within your own yard and garden. This is a picture of my house. My house faces due south. So I took this picture this morning so you can see looking east. We see here I have some anemones, blooming anemones that I had planted this year. These 2 are going to be in the sun. Actually, all 3 of them are in the sun in the morning. My smoke tree is going to shade. The house will also shade, but in the late afternoon, you'll see this gap right here between the tree and the house. This one in particular gets the late afternoon sun as well. So not only does it get sun once, it gets sun twice a day. So I always have to make sure that this one here gets a little bit more attention than the other 2 fall blooming anemones. Stop fertilizing. If we're actually in a real big drought, you want to make sure you stop fertilizing. Fertilizing helps those plants to grow and to grow fast. And so by stopping the fertilization does not mean the plants are going to stop growing. It just means they're not going to grow fast. The faster they grow, the more water they actually need. So we're just slowing down their growth a little bit. Continue to weed, because our weeds are going to be in competition for that moisture. Deadhead your flowers, because as was mentioned before, the plant wants to go to seed because it wants to reproduce itself. So if you go ahead, let the bloom there, and as soon as that bloom starts to go to seed, go ahead and take that flower head off, because it uses a lot of moisture in order to produce those seeds for reproduction. So that helps to conserve water in the plant as well. Stop or reduce using any herbicides. If you don't pull weeds or hoe the weeds, you actually do herbicides. Of course, be very careful when you're using them, but in the hot weather in particular, an herbicide will actually kind of volatilate and go into a vapor of some sort, and there could easily be some drift that could affect the plants as well. Herbicides then are in the soil, and there's not a lot of water in that soil where the weed will then absorb that herbicide into the plant to cause it to die back. Avoid using pesticides if at all possible, especially when it's hot and there's a drought. They're usually a spray that you're going to put onto the leaves on the top and the underside of the leaves. And so during the day, that makes the plant wet, but it also, because of the sun beating down on those leaves, can actually burn those leaves as well. So just pay attention to that when it comes to using your pesticides. Mulch, of course, we always want to mulch our plants if at all possible. I will admit my 2 raised beds don't have any mulch. Still waiting for those seedlings to really start to come up, and then I'll put some down because I don't want to cover up my seedlings. If you have containers or raised beds, make sure that you water them or look at them more frequently, simply because they're going to dry out. They're not actually in the ground where moisture is retained. So make sure you check those. Don't forget to water your bushes and your trees. Last year we had the drought. A lot of folks didn't water their trees or their bushes. And then we noticed this spring, a lot of people were calling our offices asking what was going on with their trees and bushes. And it was simply because they had the stress of the plant from not getting enough water, and then that real quick cold snap right before the holidays. And here is a great picture from the University of California that shows drought stress on a tree that's been newly planted. Probably it's still young. We always say, at least on campus, they water the trees, newly planted trees, pay extra special attention and water them for 3 years in a row, even when it's not in a drought. Water trees usually at a drip line, because those root zones are growing out this way wherever there's a drip that's coming down from the plant. If you catch rainwater, that's something good that you can do if it's coming off of your roof. However, we recommend that you don't put it on any of your edible plants, because think about what's on the roof. You have, if you've got roof tiles up there, you have any of those chemicals that might be on those shingles, but also remember birds like to roost on the top. So we just want to make sure that your plants are healthy and not contaminated when you're going to be eating any of those fruits or vegetables. Definitely water your other plants with that water. It's a good idea to catch it when it does rain in a drought. And a lot of times we're seeing with our climate, we're noticing changes. There's a lot of deluge of that rain. So go ahead and capture that, but don't use it on your vegetables and fruits. And that's all that I have at this point.
Thank you, Debbie. Any question for Debbie, please put it in the chat and we might address it either today or maybe next week. So we're going to keep going to our next topic that Justin is going to talk about. It is reducing tomato diseases. Justin?
Hey, Ramon. I noticed we had Pong on. I wanted to make sure he had time to do his segment. Maybe we can jump to him and see how much time we have left.
All right. Peng, are you ready?
Yeah, sure. I will be quick. Yeah, let me share my screen.
So Peng is gonna look into I see sick plants and gonna give us some tips.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Peng from Plant Diagnostic Clinic. Welcome to I See Sick Plants. Every month I would like to have a one session. I call it a special edition. So I'm gonna pick the one of the most I would say weirdest or trickiest or difficult sample and give you guys a test. So what could be today's the sick plants? So as you can see from this photo, this is apparently beans, and on the bean pod you can see those holes all over the bean pods. You can see from here and here, and looks like something is injuring the plant, of course, and the plants, they don't look happy. So what could be the cause? So I actually list some option here. So first, it called a seed explosion. Second, bean-loving woodpeckers. The third one is sometimes the hummingbirds. D is weird insect damage. E is plant hormonal disorder. The last one is my favorite, which is the three-peater. That's from my kids' favorite video game, Plants vs. Zombies. So what could be your guess for this disease? I will let our technician, our IT tech to give the poll, and I will go back to the photo to let you review it again. I give you 10 more seconds. Yeah, I saw some comments about seed explosion. That's great guess. All right, let me end the poll and share the result. Most of people pick the option of weird insect damage. Some pick the plant hormonal disorder. So nobody picked the hummingbirds, of course. They don't like the beans. So let me review the answer. So this is actually caused by corn earworm. You may not be you may be surprised that how the corn insect will favor the soybean. So according to the extension specialist in Virginia Tech, the lesion are due to this corn earworm, which is sometimes moves to the beans late in the growing season when it has exhausted its corn food supply. So this garden may have the both corn and beans in the same sites. Once the corn earworm finish the corn, they move to the beans, starting eating the attack the bean pods for the beans. Did you get the right answer? I see you next week.
Thank you, Peng. That was good. I did not know. I never seen that symptom before, so that's good information for all of us. So if we still have a little time, I don't know, Justin, how depend on you.
Yeah, I can go ahead, Ramon.
Okay, so Justin now is going to talk about some tomato diseases.
All right, thanks, Ramon. So I'm going to talk about foliar diseases of tomatoes. I'm specifically going to focus on cultural management. I'm not going to go into great detail about the different diseases. I'm going to be talking about some of these plant foliar diseases and how they're impacted by moisture. So what causes foliar diseases? Well, there could be several different causal organisms at hand. But diseases occur as a result of the combination of three factors. So you can have a pathogen present, but not have the disease because maybe there's not a susceptible host. You could have the pathogen present, but it doesn't infect the plant and become a disease because there's not a favorable environment. So in order for a disease to occur, these three different circles must intersect for that pathogen to affect the susceptible hosts in a favorable environment to form a disease. So we're going to look at three different factors that we can influence or proactively work to control foliar diseases. Host resistance. So tomato varieties, particularly our hybrid varieties, have been bred to reduce susceptibility to disease from certain pathogens. Our hybrid varieties do tend to have more bred resistance than our heirloom varieties. Seed catalogs can be a good place to look for disease resistance. You'll see these little codes that have different letters that correspond to different diseases. And so look for disease resistant varieties. The link on the bottom there that will also be in the chat box is a website from Cornell that lists a lot of different disease resistant vegetables. And that particular link will take you to a tomato page. It does actually have a list of heirlooms that have some disease resistance as well. From what I've looked at with different disease resistance, a lot of the resistance is to soil-borne diseases, which we'll talk about a little bit later down the road. But there are a fair number of varieties that are resistant to some of our foliar diseases like late blight, early blight, and leaf mold. So what can we do to modify the environment? You'll see the picture on the upper right-hand corner here kind of shows how this cycle goes. So you have fungal spores in the soil that infect a plant. They then sporulate and produce more spores, which can come back and infect the plant. So there's this disease cycle, and that's why crop rotation is important. We can modify the environment by preventing splash up, and mulch is a really effective way to reduce water splashing up from the soil that could carry fungal spores onto the tomato leaves. This can be an organic mulch such as straw. You can also use plastic mulches. I've seen a lot of folks use the plant. So there's this disease. I've seen a lot of folks use landscape fabric, where that's a woven material that allows some rain to come through, and they'll burn holes in there, for instance, to plant the plants in. Also, pruning lower leaves, those are the ones that are most likely to get splash up on them, can help reduce the infection. Other ways to modify the environment, making sure we have appropriate airflow in the canopy. So doing things like staking and trellising to get those tomatoes up, to get them spreading out. Also wider plant spacing, just making sure those plants aren't too crowded, as well as pruning. You can see in this picture here, this middle leaflet is a sucker, and so suckers will grow between leaf axils. So getting those pulled out of there. At all possible, avoid overhead irrigation. So if your only option is overhead irrigation, irrigate early in the morning from 4 to 6 a.m. Otherwise, it's better to use soaker hoses and drip irrigation. These fungal spores, the way that they germinate is impacted by the duration of leaf wetness. So we cannot control the rainfall, but there's a lot of other things we can do in terms of canopy management and how we irrigate to reduce the amount of time that those leaves are wet. Okay, sanitation and crop rotation. You want to purchase transplants that are free of signs of disease. This could also be plants that you're growing yourself. Make sure that you're not planting diseased plants. If you are saving seed, it's recommended to do a hot water bath treatment. There'll be a link in the chat that can go into more detail about that. Rotation is really critical though. So plants in the same solanaceous family, tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, potatoes, these need to be grouped together and moved to a different garden location every year. Ideally, shoot for a 3 to 4 year rotation. That way, you have fungal spores that build up in that first year, and by the time you get to that 4th year of that rotation and the solanaceous crops are back in the same place, hopefully a fair amount of those fungal spores will have deteriorated. During the season, remove infected foliage and fruit, and make sure at the end of the season to remove all crop residue. Just a couple disease photos here. So this is Passiflora fulva, or leaf mold. You can see the mold growing there. Oftentimes you'll see a yellow coloration on the top of the leaf and that visible mold growth on the bottom of the leaf. You also see gray mold or botrytis. Septoria leaf spot is probably the one that I see most commonly from gardeners. And another one would be early blight or late blight, which I don't have a picture on here of late blight. So you can submit a sample to the MU Plant Diagnostic Clinic. You can also send us pictures. We're happy to take a look at what's going on. But that MU Plant Diagnostic Clinic is a great resource because Pong and his lab will actually culture out those organisms, grow them out, and then look at them under a microscope to figure out what's actually going on. And lastly, I like to always start with those cultural controls first because we like to use pesticides as a last option. There are a number of different fungicide options. I believe this table is from a Clemson University document that has a good list of fungicides that are available to use by home gardeners. Just make sure you follow that label that will give you information about concentration, how often you can spray, if there's any kind of temperature restrictions. Debbie mentioned that earlier. PPE, so do you need to wear gloves? Do you need to wear a mask, long sleeves? A lot of times pesticides recommend to use an adjuvant or a surfactant, which is a material that's mixed in with the spray solution that allows it to stick to the leaves better. Pre-harvest intervals, so if you're going to harvest tomatoes, can you spray something the same day, or do you need to give a week interval before you can harvest? Always follow the pollinator precautions. All new pesticide labels have what's called a B box that the EPA has pushed through, so you can know if there's any concerns or considerations related to pollinators. Last but not least, fungicide and insecticide resistance has been occurring across the country for quite some time. So if you're going to use fungicides extensively in the garden, it's good to rotate active ingredients. That's known as a FRAC code that will be listed on the pesticide. And this is one way we can make sure that diseases do not become resistant to these materials. And that is all I got.
Thank you, Justin. That was good information. And I hope we can do the soil-borne diseases and next week or the other. And I think we're running out of time, so we'll leave you to close the garden hour today. Give a few more tips. Justin?
Sorry, give me just one moment. Sorry, guys. Okay, so our upcoming schedule will be weekly throughout the growing season. We do really like to get your questions. Very helpful for us to see what's going on across the state. We also like to get pictures with those questions. Pictures are worth 1,000 words. And then when we get those questions, we'll then address them in the next garden hour. You can submit those questions at the ipm.missouri.edu/town halls. And we're always happy to get your questions. We dropped a lot of links in the chat box here. You can save all those links by hovering over the 3 dots in the corner and click Save Chat, so you can come back to any of those resources if you'd like to. Once again, we have horticulture specialists covering counties across the state of Missouri. We're here as a resource. We're here to help, and we're always happy to do so. So I'll give you just a moment in case you want to jot down an email address. So you can connect with your local horticulture specialist and we can offer support and help for all your questions and problems. This is what that form looks like when you submit your questions, and you can also attach your pictures. So always happy to hear from folks across the state, and we look forward to seeing you at next week's Garden Hour.